Well, wonderful. Thank you all for joining us this morning. We're going to talk about crisis planning and what happens when the crisis occurs and no pre-planning has been done. And one of the things that I really want to start with is kind of a description of what happens or the type of phone call that we often will get. And so oftentimes we'll get a call from someone who says, my loved one, whether it be a spouse, a parent, etc., has experienced a crisis, and we don't have anything in place. We don't have things like powers of attorney and healthcare decision-making documents in place. What do we do? What's our first step? So one of the first things that we always take a look at is the person still able to participate in any kind of estate planning? Because putting in place, and I'm going to go through with you all the important documents that ideally we'd love to have in place ahead of time, but even if we can't have those in place ahead of time, that we look to try to get in place even at a crisis. And it's really because these documents provide us with a much broader range of authority oftentimes, and it is making sure when possible that the individual is able to pick their decision makers, so that if the crisis continues and they lose their ability to make decisions, that those documents are in place. So one of the first things we always want to take a look at is, are there estate planning documents in place, particularly powers of attorney, healthcare proxies, and HIPAA authorization and release forms? In this type of a situation, someone's will, someone's trust really becomes less important. It's more important that we have these crises decision-making documents in place. So we'll ask, can they participate in the estate plan? And that's really a medical determination. And so we'll talk with their healthcare providers. We oftentimes get some kind of documentation in place saying, yes, this person does have the ability to be able to participate in estate planning and making decisions about their finances. And we'll go ahead and work with them to get these important crises planning documents in place. So the first one that we always want to look at is the durable power of attorney. I'm going to talk to you about what that document does, as well as the healthcare proxy, again, the HIPAA authorization and release form, and we'll talk about living wills and MOLST and how those work as well. So let's talk about powers of attorney. These are very broad-based documents in which the individual names somebody to step into their shoes to handle all decision-making for them, but healthcare. It's really akin to a financial tool. It allows the named agent, or what we call the attorney in fact, to be able to get at the person's finances, pay their bills, make decisions about investments if necessary, handle their checking account, handle their income, and be able to do what's necessary to provide for the individual. And so having a power of attorney in place when we can is critical, because there's a lot of authority under a power of attorney that we may not get under what we call a conservatorship appointment. And I'm going to talk about that afterward, because the conservatorship and guardianship route are the routes we have to take when we can't get these types of important documents in place, or if they already don't exist when the crisis occurs. So being able to put a power of attorney in place allows the individual to name the person or persons that they want to be in that important decision-making role, and it allows them to define the scope of things that the individual can do under the power of attorney. Typically, we'd be looking for what's known as an immediate power of attorney. We want this to be a document that becomes effective the moment it's signed while we're in the middle of a crisis. And so if the person has the capacity to be able to engage in putting together this type of document, we want to get it in place. And then the named agent will be able to go out and again, access finances, pay bills, and be able to deal with whatever decision-making is necessary other than healthcare. So can we get that power of attorney in place? Then we look at a healthcare proxy. Again, this is a document that the individual would put in place even in the middle of a crisis, as long as they're competent and have the capacity to be able to put the document in place, to name someone to step into their shoes for healthcare decisions. And so this document is one that really gives authority to the agent under the healthcare proxy to make a wide range of healthcare decisions. Now, one of the things about the healthcare proxy to know is that it is not specific to what the individual's wishes may be. So for instance, it doesn't tell us, does the individual want to be kept on heroic measures such as on a ventilator, or to receive extraordinary services such as the placement of a feeding tube, that kind of thing. It only gives authority. And so, if possible, being able to facilitate a conversation with the individual who's in crises to understand what's important to them is something that you'd want to do if you're the named agent. But oftentimes that's not possible. And so the agent may be flying a little blind as to, they'd have to go back and take a look, what other conversations may they have had at some point with this person, to understand the parameters as to what the healthcare decision should look like, should the person be unable to make the healthcare decisions for themselves. So again, if the person still has the capacity to enter into healthcare decision-making, getting them to put that healthcare proxy in place is imperative. If we don't have the ability, and I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes, then we need to get a guardian appointed. And that becomes a much more cumbersome, a much more expensive process to have to go through. The next document that we really like to see in place, if we can, is the HIPAA, Authorization and Release Form. So HIPAA was the privacy law that went into play in the early 2000s. And in this document, the individual will name not only their healthcare proxy so that they can speak to their healthcare providers, but they may decide to name other people as well. So for instance, if someone has, let's say, multiple children and they've asked one of them to be the healthcare proxy, then by all means, they want that child to be named on the HIPAA. But they may also decide to name their other children as well, so that everyone has the ability to speak with the healthcare. Times happens when information is attempted to be passed from one person to the next. So those who are named on the HIPAA document can speak with the healthcare providers, but they are not the decision makers. The decision makers would be the healthcare proxies. But getting this in place ahead of time can help get rid of some confusion and can help to have it so everyone's on the same page when it comes to healthcare decision making. Living wills are a little bit more of a nicety. They're not a have-to document because in Massachusetts, they're actually not legally binding. These are documents that give more specifics about someone's healthcare wishes, particularly when it comes to extraordinary measures. So this document talks about not wanting to be maintained on artificial means like a ventilator, or receiving things like feeding tubes, that kind of thing. Remember, they're not legally binding. We instead go to a proxy, but they can be helpful in terms of giving direction to the proxy about what would be appropriate in terms of decision-making for the person. Another thing that we have in Massachusetts is called a MOLST form. That stands for Medical Orders for Life-Sustaining Treatment. This is actually a document that you don't do with your attorney, but you do with your healthcare provider. And it is much more specific about your do's and don'ts around healthcare provisions, such as it can talk about do not resuscitate, do not rehospitalize, do not put in a feeding tube, or do not allow for maintenance on a ventilator. This again is done specifically with the healthcare provider. You do need to be competent in order to be able to engage in a MOLST form, but it allows for a medical order, very much like a prescription, to be written for you based on your healthcare wishes that then can follow you from one setting to another. For instance, you're in a hospital, that MOLST form, if put in place, can then follow you to a rehab facility or follow you home so that your wishes are followed regardless of what type of setting you're in. So a MOLST form can be a really helpful tool as well. But remember, all these documents that I'm talking about require that the individual still be competent and have the capacity to be able to make decisions for themselves and to be able to engage in this kind of pre-planning activity. So the first thing we look at is, can we get those important decision makers in place and the documentation in place to support that? So let's say the crisis has occurred and we can't get this person to be able to participate. They no longer have the competency or they're incapacitated. They physically are unable to participate because of something like being in a coma, that kind of thing. So what then can we do? This is where we look at obtaining either a guardianship and or a conservatorship. So let me talk to you a little bit about those processes and what they involve. Guardianships, conservatorships, this is when we're involving the courts in order to adjudicate that someone is no longer competent and to be able to participate in decision-making for themselves. And we are asking the courts to actually appoint somebody to be in that position. So a guardian ends up being a court-appointed person to handle all types of decision-making, but finances. In many ways, it's very akin to the healthcare proxy. It would allow the guardian to make specific decisions about healthcare, to be able to make decisions about where someone's going to live or where they're going to receive their healthcare. It gives a lot of authority to be able to step into the person's shoes and use what we call the best interest standard. Making. A conservatorship is to allow someone to be named, again, by the courts to be adjudicated as the conservator in order to be able to handle finances. And so this is really akin oftentimes to the power of attorney. It allows the conservator to be able to access bank accounts, to pay bills, and to make all kinds of decisions about the person's asset holdings and investments. Now, a couple of reasons why you don't want to end up having to go down this road if possible, and why putting in place ahead of time when we can those important decision-making documents is so critical. Guardianships, conservatorships, if we have to go down that road, we have no choice. We certainly can do so, but they require a couple things. First of all, they're medically based, meaning that we have to get a medical professional to actually declare this person incompetent and to be able to support that with medical documentation. We then have to present all of that to a court, and this takes time and this takes money. We find that on average, a guardianship conservatorship proceeding, when it is not contested, can run anywhere between about $3,500 and $5,500. And that's just to get the initial guardianship or conservatorship in place. A typical conservatorship can take about 9 to 12 weeks. And in the COVID environment, the courts have been getting better. In the spring, it was absolutely horrible, but we're finding that they are getting much better at dealing with this new environment and being able to get cases through. But it can take upwards of about 15 weeks, which is a long time to go without being able to access someone's financial resources. And so it can be a cumbersome proceeding. A couple of other things to know is that guardianships and conservatorship are limited in terms of what the guardian or conservator can do, where their authority lies. For instance, a guardian, when they're appointed, again, remember, this is the person who's oftentimes making the healthcare decisions for the person, is limited to not being able to make decisions about where someone's going to be placed if they need skilled nursing care. So if we have a healthcare proxy and that's in place and activated, the agent under the healthcare proxy can make decisions about placement into a nursing home if necessary. Under a guardianship, they are not allowed to do that without extra court authority. And so a guardian has to go back to the judge, has to go back into court and ask for that explicit authority. That adds time again, it adds expense, and it really is very cumbersome that the guardian has to continue to go back to the court to get approval for certain decision-making. Things like end-of-life decision-making. Under a healthcare proxy, the agent under that document has the authority to make end-of-life decisions when appropriate. Under a guardianship, they do not. They have to go back to the judge and they have to ask for explicit authority to make those kinds of decisions about whether someone should be maintained on a ventilator, whether end-of-life decision-making, even things like potentially hospice care, ceasing treatment, that kind of thing is considered extraordinary and needs the court to give additional approval, which again, all costs time, stress, and money in an otherwise difficult situation. Under a conservatorship, again, there's limitations on what a conservator can do. So for instance, the conservator may need to sell someone's property. So the individual who they are the conservator for, let's say, no longer can go home. They need a higher level of care in something like a skilled nursing facility, and it looks like this is going to be a permanent placement. They may need to sell the person's home in order to be able to either get monies to help pay for care or for planning purposes. In order to get permission to sell that home, they have to go back to the court and get the judge to approve the sale of the property. Where if a power of attorney, a durable power of attorney were in place, the agent under that document would have the authority in most circumstances. It does have to be explicit in the document, but would have the authority to sell the property without further court intervention. So again, one of the things that I'm just, really kind of trying to drive home here is, when possible, having those pre-planning documents in place is so critical, because we do have alternatives. We can go for a guardianship, we can go for a conservatorship, but they do have extraordinary expense that's involved with them, time, emotional, expenditures go with this too. It can be very draining for both the individual having to go through having a guardianship or conservatorship put over them, and for those who are trying to get the authority in place. The other thing to know about both guardianships and conservatorships is that once you're appointed in those positions, you have ongoing responsibilities to report to the court. So for instance, under a guardianship, you need to do what's called a guardian's care plan within 60 days of your appointment and give that to the court for approval. And then each year you have to file a guardian's care plan with the court to keep the court informed as to what's happening. That takes time, it takes energy, and it takes cost to have to continue to do that kind of reporting. Under the conservatorship, you again have to give the court a financial plan, which discloses what the finances of the individual looks like and what the plan is to be able to manage those finances within 90 days after the appointment. And then annually, you have to do an accounting to actually account to the court for what you've done with the finances of the individual. Now, this is a wonderful check and balance. It makes sure that the guardian and the conservator continue to do their jobs and do them properly. But it does, again, mean that there's court oversight. It means that there's additional cost that goes on an annual basis. When there's a power of attorney and a healthcare proxy, those requirements for the annual reporting are not there. Now, that doesn't mean that someone who's acting, let's say, as a power of attorney and acting as a decision maker and handling finances for someone, we always recommend that they do an annual accounting just to be sure that there are no questions about how they're managing things. But it doesn't have to be presented to a court. It doesn't have to be approved by a court, and it doesn't involve the same expense that these court proceedings do in terms of ongoing reporting. So we can always get a guardian in place if necessary and a conservator in place if the individual no longer is competent, but they are cumbersome proceedings to go through and they're costly. And so finding other ways such as pre-planning or looking to do that planning even in the crises, if we have competency and capacity, is absolutely imperative.
We do have a question. We're going to go back a little bit to the MOLST form.
Sure.
If a person has only one copy, should that be duplicated to deposit with multiple providers?
So I always recommend that MOLST form be shared so that anyone who is involved in your care ends up knowing what your wishes are and that these medical orders, again, very much like a prescription, are in place. The other thing about a MOLST form is that it should be prominently displayed, meaning that, you know, oftentimes, so back in my way long ago days, I was actually a visiting nurse. And one of the things that we would look for is when there were orders is where to find those orders. And so a lot of times people, the first places that people look for these orders, and when I'm talking about people, I'm talking about usually medical professionals who may be coming to the home or first responders, is they're going to look on the refrigerator. And if you have one of the refrigerators that are still magnetized, hanging that up in a prominent spot on the refrigerator can be very helpful. Another idea is that a copy of the MOLST form can be hung over the individual's bed. If they're getting care, particularly in a particular room on a regular basis, you may want to prominently place that on the wall or on the door so that anyone coming in and out is able to know that MOLST form is there. The purpose of the MOLST form, remember, is really to declare what your wishes are. So if you are someone who said, I don't want resuscitation, I am a do not resuscitate because of my condition, because of my illness, and that MOLST form outlines that and has been signed by a healthcare provider, We often find, particularly in the home care setting, that when someone has a crisis, when a loved one has a crisis, even if they are at the end stage of some disease process or illness, our natural inclination is to call 911. It's just what we do. We call an emergency. And so the first responders are going to come to the house. And if there is nothing telling them not to go ahead and move forward with the do not resuscitate, and something that gives them legal authority not to go forward with a resuscitation, they're going to resuscitate the person. That's their job. And so the MOLST form provides them with a legal order that they can follow and outlines exactly what they should or should not do in this case, and allows that the individual's wishes about their health care be honored. And so prominently placing that document so that anyone who may be responding to something like a call for help has clear authority to follow that document and knows what your wishes are. Does that answer the question? Was that helpful?
I think it is.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay. So now, once we know who has authority, whether it be through documentation that was done beforehand, the powers of attorney, the healthcare related documents, or through a guardianship and conservatorship, now we need to take a look at what's the next step for this individual. What type of care is going to be needed? So oftentimes we find that crisis starts with a hospitalization, not always, but oftentimes. And now that we're through the acute part of that hospitalization, as everybody knows, they try to get us out of the hospital as quickly as possible and on to the next step. What does that next step look like? So the first thing that has to be done is really understanding what the person needs. What are what we call ADLs, their activities of daily living? What can they do for themselves? What do they need support with? And at what level do they need that support? Are we looking at somebody who's had a crisis, been in an acute care setting like a hospital, but is now ready to potentially go to a rehab and then hopefully home? Are we looking at a situation in which they may be going back home again, but need a certain level of support and help to make it so they can successfully be at home? So truly understanding what those ADLs, those activities of daily living look like, what they need assistance with, what they can do independently, and what they have no ability any longer to do is critical. We want to look at things like their mobility as well. Can they safely ambulate, whether it be at home or whether it be in some type of facility, assisted living potentially, or do they need even a higher level of nursing home care? What does their ambulation look like, and how can we potentially, do we have to make modifications to get them back home again? And what do those modifications involve? And can those modifications be made both to the place where they're returning to, and can they financially, handle those types of modifications to let them come home if that's what's wanted? What kinds of services do they need around managing the household? Can they go back to paying their own bills? Does the power of attorney or the conservator still need to manage their monies for them? Who's going to be helping to take care of the financial aspect of things for them? And I don't mean paying for things, to pay for things. And can they afford that? Can they afford to go back home with the level of care? Can they afford to go to an assisted living if that's what's desired? Do they need a nursing home level of care, and how are they going to afford that? So we need to look at those aspects of things as well. Are we talking about, or when we're talking about managing household too, some other things we have to look at is how are they going to handle meals? How are they going to handle getting groceries? Who's going to make those meals? Is this just a situation in which someone needs a little support? Maybe something like Meals on Wheels, just to help give at least, one good solid meal a day in which someone's coming to check in? Do they need help with all 3 meals a day? Do they need help getting their groceries? Can they safely use their equipment at home, such as their stove? Do they know how to use a microwave? So all of that needs to be looked at, and is the individual able to manage their household? Cleaning of the household. Can they handle the cleaning? Or is this something where we need to get some assistance in to be able to do some extra cleaning for somebody on a regular basis to make sure that they're safe at home? So looking at that, looking at the outlay of the house. Can they handle stairs? If there are stairs to, let's say, to go up to the bedrooms and potentially the full bathroom. Or is the living all on one level? A bathroom, maybe it needs to be handicap accessible, bedroom on the first floor. A big thing is, where's the laundry? Where is that located in? Is it in a place where you don't have to go up and down a lot of stairs and the laundry can be managed successfully by the individual, or do they need help? And then oftentimes we're looking at questions of end of life. Is this something that has been discussed, and so are end of life wishes known? Again, assessing what type of support is needed if this is an end of life situation. What kinds of make decisions for themselves? What documentation or discussions have they had with family and loved ones about what their wishes are around end of life? Again, if they're not able to participate in those conversations themselves. Can they go home, or do they need to be in a more facility-like setting, whether that be hospice or some kind of a nursing home setting, in order to really facilitate the end of life? So all of these things we really want to take a look at in terms of determining what next steps look like for the individual. We have to know where they are now, and a couple weeks out, a few months out, 6 months, a year, those kinds of projections. And again, it's something, as any of you who have been dealing with a loved one who may have an illness, it's constantly changing and needing to be reassessed based on what's happening with them. So once we know kind of where things are, then we can start to look at what kind of interventions they need and what kinds of services they may need. One of the big questions are, can they still stay at their home if that is the desire? And again, some of the things I talked about is looking at the home setup itself. Is it conducive to bringing someone back home again? Can they again live on that one floor? Do they have to handle stairs? Where's the laundry? Who's going to handle the household aspect of things for them? If they need assistance, how are meals going to be obtained? How are they going to get back and forth to doctor's visits and to the many different follow-ups that someone needs? Who's going to go with them on that? So looking at that aspect of things and really putting together a plan to outline how these things are going to happen and who's going to be responsible for them. Is it your loved ones who can help participate? Is it paid care, paid services that will help, or a combination potentially of both? And can the person afford to have the level of assistance that they need if it's paid for services? So taking a look at all those different options. This may also be the time to look at different types of residence for someone, be it their private home, be it moving to an assisted living facility, and being able to get some additional services within an assisted living. Can they, if they stay at home, can it be supported with things like daycare programs, which oftentimes extend a person's ability to stay in their own private home, but be able to get services for certain hours a day outside of the house to give caregivers a break, to be able to allow a loved one to work if that's something that they do? Or does this person really need nursing home level care? They're no longer safe to be at home. They need a certain level of nursing services, care services that really go above and beyond what can be provided for safely in someone's home or in an assisted living. So taking a look really at their living situation and determining whether this is the current situation is a safe environment for them to either stay in or return to, or do we have to start looking at next steps? And one of the things I really encourage people to do when possible is when someone has received a diagnosis, they're in oftentimes the beginning stages. Whenever we can prior to crises, is to start thinking about what a next step may look like. If you get to that level, what would be acceptable to the person? What would they want? And when we're in crises, I often tell families while someone is, let's say, in an acute care hospital setting, and there's lots of things to have to think about, and oftentimes you don't get a lot of time to be thinking about the next step. But starting to get an understanding as to what's available in your community in terms of next steps. For instance, is there a skilled nursing facility in the community or nearby that you have had a chance to look at and be able to say, yes, this is a place that's acceptable if necessary? Thinking about what the resources are before you need them is critical when possible, because it really can help reduce the stress of being in a crisis and now having to make decisions very quickly. So having a feel for what a plan would look like. Sometimes I'll have a family who will call and say, we're just beginning to have crises. We know things are starting to change. We can start to see what's going to happen down the road. What can we do now? And what you can do is start to understand what your resources are out there, what the options are, so that you do have some clarity, if possible, before you're right in the middle of the crises and have to make quick decisions about what a next step looks like. So let's talk about what if nursing home care itself becomes necessary. Again, it's not the ultimate that for most people, it is not the goal, certainly, when we can have other options available. But sometimes it really is what is needed, whether it's that someone is no longer safe to be at home, they don't have the resources to be able to provide the level of assistance they need at home, then skilled nursing care can be sometimes the option that we have to consider. So again, when possible, using what time you do have to take a look at what options are out there for skilled nursing is important, so that you have a little bit of a feel for, where would you want this person to be geographically? What makes it easiest for as many of the support players in this person's life to get to see in their day-to-day life? So looking at geographically where the place is located, certainly looking at things like, the reputations of nursing homes. In this COVID environment, it's been definitely a main concern for many of the clients that we're dealing with about having a loved one go into a nursing home facility. And the nursing home facilities have clearly had struggles in this COVID environment. But there are certain facilities that have done a better job than others. And there can be very good facilities that still have issues that crop up, particularly with COVID, that may not be an actual indicator of the level of care that's being provided in that facility. So there are some resources out there that you can know about. One's Nursing Home Compare. Social Security does, Medicare has a nursing home compare site that you can I used to tell clients pre-COVID that certainly going to visit a facility, and I would still encourage that if you can see a facility in person to get an idea of what's happening, but check with the facility because many of them have restrictions right now, just so that you can get a feel for what's happening in the facility, what the level of activity is. We used to call it the smell test, and it really is true. When you walk into a facility, you can get an idea. But there are other ways now, and some questions you can ask. Talk about what what their population is like, what types of individuals are living there, in terms of diagnosis, in terms of age. What's the activity like? In this COVID environment, talk with them about what precautions they are putting in. What's their visitor policy and what's their restrictions on visitors? How are they going about trying to keep their residents as safe as possible in terms of this infectious disease? Talking to them about the types of services that are provided in terms of rehab services and how quickly rehab services are provided. Do they have enough physical therapists, speech therapists on staff? So asking those important questions, how many patients their nurses deal with, not only during the day, but during the evening shifts and the night shifts. So finding out some of that information. And talking when you can, if you're able to identify friends, relatives who may have gone through this or currently going through it, and what their experience may have been with facilities in your area can be very, very helpful. One of the things we always have to think about in terms of nursing home care is how you're going to pay for it. But this is something that we have to think about regardless of where care is being provided. Home care situation as well. How is that going to be paid for? Who's going to be carrying that burden of the expense? And for both nursing home level care as well as home-based or what we call community-based care, there may be state-paid options through Mass Health to help support that care and to pay for that care. There are eligibility rules about becoming eligible for that benefit. We look at things like assets, we look at income. And again, with the planning, there may be some options that we can utilize even in a crisis, particularly when we have a husband and wife or married spouses, to be able to protect assets for the individual who is the healthier one of the two of you. And so even though we might be in the middle of a crisis, we may be able to do some shifting of assets, some protection of assets in order to get qualified for state assistance to pay for either community-based healthcare, and this is healthcare to keep somebody at home, things like home health aides at home, things like potentially even shopping assistance, household cleaning assistance, that kind of thing through the Mass Health program, or skilled nursing level care in which Mass Health then covers long-term care services for the individual. And so talking about what those options look like and whether some planning tools can be used even in the 11th hour is important to explore whether there's something that might be able to be done to help find ways to pay for this type of care. Some resources that I want to make sure people know about, and again, whether you're in the middle of the crises or hopefully before a crisis occurs with your loved one, get to know some of the resources in your area. One of the first things to begin with is the Council on Aging in each town. They're fantastic. They have tremendous amounts of programs. Talk with them, find out what they offer, what kinds of resources that they have to be able to help, particularly support somebody staying in the community and staying at home. We also have a thing in Massachusetts called an ASAP, and this is an access point for senior services. Here in Acton in particular, it's Minuteman Senior Services who services our catchment area. And in the Sudbury area, it's BayPath. And I believe in the Burlington area, it's also Minuteman Senior Services. But These are quasi-state organizations. There are 26, I believe, throughout Massachusetts, whose responsibility is to provide for the seniors and disabled within their catchment areas, within their towns. And they're the ones who often run what's known as the Meals on Wheels program, but they have a variety of other programs. They have home health aides, they have homemakers to come in and help with cleaning services. They may have grocery shopping support services. They have care management services at times, and they are the ones who help determine eligibility for home-based community mass health services. This is different than VNA services. This is services provided to help someone stay in the community under Medicaid, under Mass Health here in Massachusetts. So getting to know your ASAP, know who services your area, and finding out what kinds of services they have ahead of time can be really important. Aging specialists, we used to call these care managers, but these are private individuals whose job is, whose real profession is to work with seniors and disabled on a private basis around things like placement into different living situations, whether it be assisted living, whether it be trying to stay at home or nursing home placement, helping to coordinate bringing in services and to make sure that if you need a little bit of a shortcut or help in identifying resources, they can be phenomenal in terms of doing that. Understanding your health insurance is really important. Understanding what Medicare covers and doesn't cover. And if you have private health insurance, whether it be one of the enhanced Medicare plans or through an employer still, through retirement, understanding your healthcare options so that, again, you have some clarity about what may or may not be covered before you need it can be super helpful. And by all means, understanding what insurance you have is critical. Through the Council on Aging, particularly this time of year, when under the Medicare program, people are able to choose enhanced programs if they want to, working with a SHINE counselor, SHINE. They are out of the Councils on Aging, and they are really fantastic resources to help you to look at your insurance and your insurance options and to be able to choose what plans may be most beneficial given your particular situation. There are also disease-based organizations, the Alzheimer's Association, the Parkinson's Association, different cancer associations, who can be really helpful and have resources as well. Resources for those who are deaf, resources for the blind are all what we call disease-based support organizations, and they have resources that may be helpful to you. And then lastly, 2 online places that I recommend people look at. Mass.gov has healthcare related resources, particularly around Medicaid. Talks a lot about eligibility and the types of services that one may be able to obtain through Medicaid. And then Medicare.gov, which really talks about Medicare benefits and what kinds of benefits that you may be able to access through your Medicare program. So knowing your resources ahead of time can be really critical in helping you to navigate a crisis for a loved one, to be able to get them the benefits and services that are going to be most useful, and to help relieve as much stress as possible that you as the caregiver, or at least the one who's coordinating all of this, may be under. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope this is helpful, and I wish everyone wonderful health, and believe it or not, starting to get into the holiday season. So a little different this year, but hope you get a little relaxation. Bye now.